Hello, this is Elif and welcome to Puzzle the News podcast. Today I'll be interviewing Chandni Chopra from Heaton in Newcastle. She is a solicitor, human rights activist, the sole chair of Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and independent candidate for Heaton Ward. So hello Chandni, and would you like to please introduce yourself further?
Yes, hi Elif. Thanks for having me on your podcast. It's a great honour. So yes, I suppose you've covered it all there. I was a former candidate in the local elections. I didn't win, but I did beat the Tories and the Lib Dems, which was a great achievement within itself, considering that I didn't have any party backing, and I also campaigned for 4 weeks. I'm also a mother of a 3-year-old, and I live in Heaton with my husband and child, where we moved back from Cyprus in 2020.
Okay.
Thanks, Elif.
And you have a history of being a solicitor. I don't know if you still are a solicitor now, but I know you are a very active human rights activist. Would you like to explain a bit more about what inspired you to become a solicitor and human rights activist?
Sure. Well, when I completed my degree, the title for my dissertation was on international law, and the title itself was called The Role of the UN in Their Pursuit of International Peacekeeping. And it wasn't until then I really had a strong interest in international humanitarian law, especially treaties and laws which governed the way states would treat victims of war crimes, war criminals, victims of sex trafficking. So shortly after I completed my degree, I went on to complete a master's in law. Well, it's a diploma actually, an LPC, which you would need to complete to qualify as a solicitor. And I decided following my diploma even, that I wanted to travel abroad because of my interest in international law. So I decided to move to Tanzania for 6 months on a UN-led initiative which was aimed at halving global poverty. So when I did this, it was my first real experience of living in an environment where families and individuals were living in absolute poverty. And it was something that just, I suppose, empowered me to feel like I wanted to do more. So when I came back from Tanzania after my 6-month placement with the UN, it was around the time Gaza was being bombed in 2014, Operation Protective Edge. For those who don't know, that onslaught saw the outright murder of 3,500 Palestinian civilians, including 555 children. And I was there around the time of the bombings in Gaza by Israel, which was around August, early September 2014. And I spent some time in the West Bank, Hebron, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Geneva, Berlin, where we were actually shot at and chased by tanks and tear gassed by the occupation forces. So when I came back from Palestine, the horrors, which was only a fraction of what I witnessed, was enough for me to feel that I knew at that point I would be immersing myself in human rights activism and law. A year later, I completed my training contract in criminal defence law at a firm in Newcastle city centre, and I went on to specialise in criminal defence, which is closely aligned with human rights law as well. A lot of it is the human rights legislation, for example, right to a fair trial, right to family life, and other articles are used as a basis for advocating in criminal defence. And then from there, I think this was 10 years ago, so I've been heavily involved in human rights activism for the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've got a very, very rich past experiences of, doing a lot of activism. And you explained that when you were in Palestine, you were attacked, you were chased.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please explain about that experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, before I explain, I just want to note that that experience for me only lasted about 10 minutes, but that's 24/7 for the occupied Palestinian people in the West Bank. We were in a village in Berlin, and at that time, the Israeli Defense Forces had been funding and funding and constructing an illegal Israeli settlement on Palestinian land for over 10 years. And every Friday, the locals would come out after Friday prayers to protest against the encroachment of this illegal settlement on their land. People had died, people had been shot, people had been illegally arrested and placed on administrative detention just for protesting this illegal settlement, which is at odds with international law under the Geneva Convention. Settlements are a war crime. So this particular Friday, we attended the protest to support the locals and provide an international presence. Within around 4 minutes of us arriving, around 20 Israeli Defense Forces squatters came out with sniper guns which housed steel-coated rubber bullets, which are actually internationally banned weapons because they have the capacity to infiltrate the human skull. We were then tear-gassed. I don't know, for those who are listening, some of you may have been tear-gassed, but the experience of being tear-gassed is absolutely horrendous. You feel nauseous, it burns the inside of your nasal passages, your throat, it gets in your lungs, you feel like you're going to pass out. It makes your eyes and your nose water to the point you can barely see where you're walking. So it was pretty extreme. And we were also shot at with these internationally banned weapons, these steel-coated rubber bullets. Only a few months before we demonstrated there, a 2-month-old baby had actually died from inhaling too much tear gas because it had entered the bedroom of this baby. And that's not uncommon, actually. There's a history of Palestinian children suffocating from Israeli tear gas. So it's really quite extreme in terms of the kind of damage it can do, particularly to the locals. Following this, the wall itself, the illegal apartheid wall, which is again against international law, it's the ICJ actually issued a ruling in 2004 to state that this wall is against international law, and that construction must immediately stop. Unfortunately and sadly, but somewhat unsurprisingly, the Israeli occupation have continued to construct that wall, and a large part of that wall is in the village of Berlin, where we were providing an international presence. And when you look at the wall, it's 26 foot high. It really can't be climbed. I mean, it's monstrous, actually. It's an eyesore and it snakes through the West Bank. But inside the wall, the Israeli occupation forces have doors where tanks can come through. I mean, I say doors, it's almost like an automatic. It looks like something from a dystopian post-apocalyptic movie, the way it's constructed. So these walls opened out inside the apartheid wall, and the tank just came at us. And 3 of our comrades at the time were brutalised and arrested, and one of the colleagues I was with was actually hit in his ankle by the back of a sniper gun and was detained for 10 hours. Luckily, the rest of us managed to escape, but who knows what would have happened, because the Israeli occupation forces are brazen and they're not afraid of harming and in some cases murdering international activists. Just look at the cases of Tom Herdman and Rachel Corrie, and that's just to name a few.
Mm-hmm. Oh, just hearing all of that, it sounds scary, and it just comes to show what happens there, and to see what happens there, going there and experiencing it yourself can help you understand what's really happening. I just wanted to ask, because after experiencing something like that, I'm sure you haven't experienced something like that before ever, how has that changed you as a person? Like, when you came back, is that what inspired you to enter into this Palestinian activism and basically give your time and efforts to it, like, since then?
I think when I went out there, I didn't know what to expect. I would probably say I was actually quite naive. At that point, the only thing I'd really done on the international spectrum was complete the dissertation in human rights and international law. And moved to Tanzania, but actually being there and witnessing the horrors that the Palestinians have to live with day by day, which their ancestors and their descendants have gone on to live alongside, was something that was really out of this world. Some of the things and testimony I heard, and I'll just provide a couple of examples. Whilst we were in Jerusalem, we spent time with a family who only 2 days before that, their son, 17-year-old son, had been shot in the back of the head by an Israeli sniper whilst praying inside of his local mosque. We went to Hebron, where we went to Al-Khalil Mosque, where some 20 years before, an Israeli fanatic went inside of that mosque and shot to death 36 Muslim worshippers, and the whole of Hebron since that point had been on lockdown. Locals were terrified. It's a daily occurrence, Palestinians getting killed just for leaving their own homes, you know, in their indigenous land. And we also, of course, which I touched on earlier, witnessed the illegal apartheid wars snaking through the West Bank, cutting off huge chunks of Palestinian land, olive trees, fertile land, water, dividing entire communities. So, I mean, I'm really just talking about a fraction here. When I witnessed that and came back, I felt as though I had a responsibility to share what I saw, because the Palestinians in the West Bank don't have that privilege. And I realised just how privileged I actually am to live a life where I can openly, well, I say openly, at this point, with all of the restrictions being placed on our right to protest, but back then in 2014, where I can openly talk about human rights abuses and openly call out on a public platform the perpetrators. And I just felt like I needed to do something. So I went on to join PSC, and then I subsequently went on to visit the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon in 2019. Which was, wow. I mean, that's really a topic. We won't have time to talk about it now, but that's a topic that needs a whole podcast in itself. There's over 800,000 Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon. I would say 90% of them are victims of the Nakba, which was the invention of Israel on ethnically cleansed Palestinian land in 1948, and then the subsequent Nakba in 1967, which saw the illegal occupation of East Jerusalem, Gaza, and other parts of the West Bank. So there's generations of Palestinians living in those camps who have a legal right of return back to their land in Palestine, and unfortunately they've also been targeted in those camps as well. The Sabra and Shatila massacre, for example, we went to Sabra Shatila camp and spoke to victims who had survived that massacre in 1982. So this occupation is so deep rooted. It isn't just confined to the land of Palestine. It's actually created one of the biggest refugee crises in the world, seeing over 7 million Palestinians dotted around the whole planet. And it really started a journey for me. The point I'm trying to make is that it started a journey for me to see what the byproduct of the Israeli occupation was and the horrors it has gone on to create since its invention in 1948. So it's been, I wouldn't say it's been just an isolated experience visiting Palestine. It started a journey that's changed my whole life and my whole perspective on geopolitics and Western governments.
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to ask, as you were explaining about over the years, all the experiences of what's been happening in Palestine overall, and you've been able to witness this yourself by going there, would you say what's happening right now could be argued as being the second Nakba?
Well, I would say that the Nakba never really stopped. It's probably, in my opinion, and bearing in mind, I wouldn't say I'm a specialist in geopolitics. I've just got a lot of experience in international law, but from the years of observing the horrors and atrocities and war crimes taking place in the West Bank and the whole of historic Palestine, it's been a continuation of the original Nakba, which I would even argue started way before 1948. It started as soon as the British were imposed themselves into the land of Palestine. Just to note as well that the numbers that we're seeing coming out of Gaza, which have recently emerged to be as high as 200,000 slaughtered Palestinians, actually far outreach those of the original Nakba in 1948, which saw 850,000 Palestinians ethnically cleansed from their indigenous land. And the sad thing about this whole thing is that it's not just those inside of historic Palestine who are being affected, it's those on the outside who have that legal right of return as well, as per UN Resolution 194, and of course are being prohibited from doing so.
Okay. So do you want to explain to me, as an activist who's very involved with the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign in the UK, what have you been doing to raise the awareness of what's been happening in Gaza over the months? And if you just want to expand on that and just explain how you've been trying to advocate for Palestinian rights over the months.
Sure. So just focusing solely since the genocide began in October last year, because if I was to focus on all of the actions that we've done, we would be here for the whole day. But for the first 6 months, we were coming out every single week, every Saturday without fail, out on the streets, and we saw numbers as high as 2,000 people coming out at some of our earlier demos in October, November time, to protest against the war crimes and crimes against humanity that Israel are committing inside of Gaza, which of course is being enabled by our democratically elected officials and Western leaders. I would say more recently, the main, I wouldn't say leadership, but the main extremely powerful initiatives are coming from the students around the country, particularly in Newcastle. Newcastle University for this last 35 days have had an encampment at the Newcastle on the grounds of the university to highlight the university's lucrative arms trade and investment deals with Israeli arms companies. Leonardo is to name one, Keysight, I believe, is the name of the other one, but others too. And they have relentlessly camped on the grounds of the university day in, day out, holding rallies every single day at 5 o'clock to show the university that they will not budge unless the university discloses its lucrative corporate relationships with the colony state of Israel and divests. So really recently the students have been leading the revolution for the liberation of the Palestinian people. We've also had a doctor visit us from Gaza with absolutely gut-wrenching testimony of what he had to endure whilst ultimately looking after patients who were victims of bombings. And I'm talking about completing amputations without anaesthetic, completing cesareans and births, again without anaesthetic, having to label Palestinian babies as unidentified without family. I mean, some of the worst things you can imagine. We've also attended various MP surgeries to protest their cowardly is the word I would use, decisions to abstain from motions to pass permanent ceasefires inside Gaza. We have branch meetings every week for the first 6 months, but every 2 weeks as of recently. And in that time, we're planning, I would say, up to 5 actions within a 2-week period to highlight what is going on in Gaza and the West Bank, of course, and the whole of historic Palestine. It's really been non-stop action. And of course, there's also been the continuous demonstrations outside of Raphael Arms Factory in Scotswood. that arms factory it's an Israeli state-owned arms factory, and it's providing components to weapons which are being used upon the civilian population of Gaza. Arms factories around the countries have been seeing similar protests, and there's been successful demonstrations where arms factories such as Elbit Systems in Shenstone, for example, have been shut down, and rightly so. I mean, this is really just summarising some of the actions that we've been involved with over the last 8 months.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you explained about these protests and how they've been bringing a lot of change and contributing to a larger movement to bring justice and equality for Palestinians. Do you want to explain as an activist, because you are the Newcastle sole chair of Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, so you do participate in all the protests, pretty much all the protests that happen almost every week. Have you faced any challenges or obstacles while participating in these protests? And if so, how do you motivate yourself to continue doing what you're doing every week?
I mean, a really good recent example I can think of was the extreme police brutality that students and activists were exposed to at one of our demonstrations last week at the university on the campus grounds. The demonstration itself took place after the horrendous bombing in Rafah on the 26th of May, where 70 Palestinians were effectively burnt alive, and people around the world saw images of headless babies and charred individuals being pulled from tents. So we decided upon an emergency rally at the university. The campus called the police and security, and police officers from both Scottish Border Force and Durham attended that university to try and quash our protests. Several activists occupied a building inside of the campus grounds and renamed that building Hind's Hall after the 6-year-old Hind, who was of course slaughtered by Israeli Defence Forces in Gaza a few months ago. She was 6 years old. It was in her name, and there is video footage of police officers using batons against activists, pulling off hijabs off young Muslim sisters. A 15-year-old boy came out of that demonstration with extreme purple bruising along his arms, and one of our colleagues, who I won't name in case she wouldn't want me to, for confidentiality reasons, left the RVI the next day with 2 broken ribs. And the police brutality, I have to admit, is becoming harsher, and we knew this was going to happen because the protests are becoming stronger. People are more organised, people are getting more galvanised, the numbers are becoming bigger, and the reason for that is because of our so-called leaders, our democratically elected officials, and our educational institutions ultimately ignoring the demands of the public and of the protesters to stop the genocide, to call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, and of course to divest from the squatter colony state of Israel. And none of those demands have been met. Instead, the establishment have responded with harsher policing tactics, and they've even gone on to change and make protesting laws stricter. So they've introduced a new law under the Public Order Act, I believe, 2023. I think that's the name of the act. I'm sure lawyers out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm certain that's the name of the act, which have ultimately legislated for stronger enforcement measures for those who attend protest and are found guilty of protest-related activity, such as that of locking on inside protests or causing an inconvenience, I would say, to the infrastructure or the day-to-day running of transport. And I think, in my opinion, and this is just from being so heavily involved in the movement for so long, that these laws and the extreme police brutality is an abuse of the state's power and is also an indication that the state, the establishment, and these institutions will not back down and instead are trying to, I would say, dictate the way protesters should behave and ultimately restrict the way we as protesters and activists should express ourselves. We have a legal right to protest under the Human Rights Act, under Article 10 and Article 11 of the Human Rights Act. We have a right to freedom of protest and a right to freedom of expression. And I would go so far as to argue to say that those rights are being compromised by the state.
Mm-hmm. And now we're seeing, obviously, what's happening in Gaza getting worse and worse. And as someone who lives in the UK, how do you see of your government, and as also a human rights activist as well, and who has also previously been an independent candidate for Heaton Ward, in what ways do you think politics plays out with what's happening in Gaza right now by the UK politics, and how, as someone as yourself, is trying to bring some sort of change or trying to raise awareness of, like you mentioned about the factory and all these armed weapon factories around the UK, and how the UK government aren't doing really anything about it. If you want to explain about like how, as activists, you are all trying to basically kind of fight against the system and trying to bring some sort of change in the world.
I mean, I would say that in order to answer that question, I think it's really important to highlight that the decision not to call for a ceasefire, a permanent, lasting ceasefire, and ensure that Israel abides by its obligations under international law, that the decision not to call for this ceasefire is a political decision. Our democratically elected officials who sit in Parliament, a lot of them, particularly in the Conservative Party, and many who are, of course, MPs in the North East. Prime examples are Catherine McKinnell, Sharon Hodgson, Chi Unwara. Some of these MPs sit on Labour Friends of Israel. They are bought and paid for by the Israeli lobby to peddle a certain narrative to ensure that Israel remains in the shadow of a positive public image. I mean, they've already lost the propaganda war. The images will haunt many of us for life. And, the images in itself are a damning indictment of Israel's crimes. But the decision not to call for a ceasefire is deliberately being evaded by those in power because of all of the lucrative trade deals and arms deals that it has with the squatter entity of Israel. A good example of this is the UK's lucrative arms deal, in which it issues £4 billion worth of arms licenses. It recently issued £4 billion worth of arms licenses in the face of a legal advisory opinion where 600 lawyers advised the British government that in issuing such a license, this would be in contravention to international law, because these arms are very likely being used to commit war crimes in Gaza. So the decision by our governments not to issue this ceasefire is political. It's to do with finance, it's to do with money, it's to do with power, and it is nothing to do with peace and nothing to do with the lives of innocent Palestinians living in Gaza. And we have to shed light on this. There's also a conflict of interest, and I'm glad you brought up the arms factory on Scotswood, Raphael Arms Factory. A Labour Lord Heaton, who isn't even elected, one of our legislators, actually has stakes, has shares in this arms factory. So the more this factory makes in terms of arms, the more this factory trades, the more he gets back in his investments. I mean, how can this Labour government claim to be neutral and claim to care about the Palestinian people if they are making money from the deaths of Palestinian people? So we have to remember that the change does not lie in our democratically elected officials or our so-called leaders. The power in terms of change is going to come from the public, is going to come from us. So we must remain steadfast. We must continue to get out on the streets. We must continue to go and call out on a public platform these elected officials and highlight their complicity in the genocide in Gaza, in not calling for a ceasefire. And we must continue till our very last breath to support the students in their fight to challenge the establishment. Ultimately, these students are putting their livelihood on the line. They may not even graduate. Some of them are facing disciplinary actions. Some of them may not even get a degree. They're literally throwing their entire futures away to fight for the futures of Palestinians whom they haven't even met. I mean, that is something. The hope lies in the students, the hope lies in the public, and the hope lies in the activists. So we can't give up. Actually, the establishment and Israel are relying on the public to get tired, and they're relying on us to stop coming out on the streets, to stop challenging those in power, because once we get tired, that gives them free rein to do whatever the hell they like, which they're doing anyway, but it allows them to continue with their actions. So if anything, we must remain determined and carry on doing everything we can, whether it's sharing things on social media, making videos of what we know about the situation in Gaza so far, attending a demonstration, even talking about the crimes in your local place of work. You know, now is not the time to care about your public image. Now is not the time to care about losing followers. Innocent Palestinian children are being beheaded. People are being burnt alive. This isn't the time to think about yourself. It's the time to make your mark on the world and do what you can in your capacity as a privileged person, as a human being who is protected by a democratic right to protest. It is the time to use your privilege to speak out about the genocide in Gaza in whatever way you humanly and possibly can.
Mm-hmm. And just to end the podcast, I just wanted to ask one more question, as this is a very modern day kind of genocide, shall we call it. We are seeing a lot of footages, pictures coming through every day, and we're seeing children, women in conditions that not normal humans see in a daily basis. As someone like yourself, you're a mother and you're a wife. How has what you have been seeing on social media coming out from Gaza affected you, and in what way has it like changed you as a person?
If I'm honest, I would say, speaking for myself here, and I know many others feel the same, I personally will never be the same again. What we as humans and citizens of this planet are witnessing is the most broadcast genocide this century. We are literally witnessing a genocide in real time before our eyes. And all you need to do is get on Instagram, and the first thing you see on your newsfeed are images of Palestinian men, women and children with their limbs blown off, with their brains hanging out of their skulls. I don't want to get too graphic because I don't know who's going to be listening to this podcast, and I really don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable, but this is the reality of what we're seeing. And as humans, it is not inherently normal for us to experience this trauma. And that's actually what I would describe it as. I would describe it as trauma. And that is not to undermine the trauma that the Palestinians are going through on a day-to-day basis by losing their family members in the most macabre, brutal way possible. I'm talking about the secondary trauma that us as activists are being exposed to by witnessing these crimes. And then the feeling of hopelessness, that it doesn't matter how much we shout and scream and protest, nothing changes. But actually what we need to do is use that as fuel to remind ourselves why we're doing this. because in the future, when this is written about in history books, when this is talked about as one of the worst and most tragic cases of injustice against the Palestinian people, we're going to ask ourselves, what did we do? What did we do at that time when that genocide was happening to talk about it, to make a difference? And at least we can tell ourselves and feel comfortable within ourselves that we did the best we possibly could. When I look at my little girl now, I feel so lucky and grateful that I live in an environment where I'm not worrying she's going to be killed by a bomb in the night, or she's going to be burnt by white phosphorus gas, or she's going to be targeted by a drone, you know. And when I see these kids in Palestine, my little girl's age, I see her face in them, and it literally, physically, mentally and emotionally destroys me. And I have to tell myself that Maya's life is valuable, and the Palestinian kids that are being slaughtered in Gaza, their lives are equally as valuable. And for those kids to be slaughtered without repercussion makes me question just how valuable are the lives of all of our children. If these kids can be killed without consequences, what does that mean for our children? So we have to fight as a parent, as mothers, as women, as activists until our very last breath to ensure that in the future we can go back and tell our children that we were on the right side of history. So, I mean, I have to be honest, in terms of the images coming out of Gaza, I am changed. I will never be the same again. Everything's affected. My sleep is affected. The way my whole perspective on humanity has been affected. But I'm glad that I'm affected, because it's the fuel that I'm using to push myself, I would say. It's a hard question, that one, Elif. I have to be honest. It's a tough one, because I really haven't came to terms with it myself, and I'm still learning something new about myself every day, about how I'm processing the images that I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for your time, Chandni. If you want to add anything else, this is a chance to.
Yeah, I would just say to those who are politically active and those who are coming out on the streets, don't give up. The tide is turning. There's been various successes recently. Encampments around the country have forced their universities to divest. Unfortunately, Newcastle's been slow on this, but Cambridge is a good example. They forced universities to divest. Only 3 days ago, Pret Manger, the coffee chain, decided not to open 40 stores inside of historic Palestine or Israel because of the pressure of BDS. People are starting to realise the tide is changing. Israel are losing the propaganda war. It's even converting those who would formerly have supported Israel to come out on the streets and fight for the liberation of the Palestinian people. So just carry on doing what you're doing. And for those who have been silent, and those who know what's going on who know what's happening in Gaza, and those democratically elected officials, politicians and world leaders who may come by this podcast on a whim, you are spineless, you are cowardly, and you should be utterly ashamed of yourself for siding with a terrorist squatter entity which has outrightly slaughtered thousands of Palestinian people. And I hope one day, when this is written about in history books, your names are mentioned as one of the perpetrators and enablers of this genocide. I just wanted to end with that. Sorry, I know I have to get that off my chest.
That's totally understandable. But once again, thank you for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was very enriching, and all the best in your activism and in the future. And we all do pray that what's happening in Gaza does come to an end, because, like you said, the images coming out, it's horrendous to see. As a journalist myself, it's hard to just watch and see of these things and not feel anything. So yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you for your time, Elif, and once again, thank you for having me on your show. It's a great honour.